Hey, it's Josh Vergara. What's going on, everybody? We're here on the Vivo X80 Pro, and by all accounts, this might be a monster of a camera. But I'm talking about the rear cameras, because we're starting off this video on the front-facing camera, and already I have to use my usual complaints when it comes to many of these Chinese flagship phones. No 4K on the front. So that's pretty disappointing once again. And also the dynamic range could also use quite a bit of work. That being said though, we're going to get into the rear cameras, and I have a lot of wonderful subjects around here to photograph and to take videos of.
Wonderful subject.
I was about to say, hello! What's going on, everybody? Alright, there's so much to talk about with this camera system, and I just want to make it clear that while I do try to show a fair amount of it off, I'm doing this camera test like any other one. This is a look at how it fared in my specific personal experience, which in this case was basically on vacation on the white sand beaches of Boracay. I will chime in from time to time to give more details and perspective regarding this phone, but for the most part I was using various modes that would be practical for someone that is, well, on vacation or just out and about with these cameras in their pocket. I did use this phone as my main during the trip, posting on social media when I could while enjoying my time there. I mean, this is a full-on flagship device, which means it worked well as an everyday device. My Edition has the Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 processor and has a high refresh rate, high resolution screen. Now, I haven't actually played that many games on the X80 Pro, but for general usage, I obviously have had no complaints. There is one interesting feature that has been added to the X80 Pro, and you can kind of see it in this large rectangle here on the bottom. There is a new, much larger fingerprint sensor. This is not the first time that we've seen it. It just makes it a little bit easier to just press really anywhere in that area. You don't have to be so precise as to where you hit the fingerprint sensor, so that's nice. It's about as fast as any other one that I have used though. In general, the phone is designed typically, with unique aspects appearing in obvious places, like the monster camera area. What I love about this whole camera setup is how there's some cohesiveness in that circular area, and then it's like Vivo remembered that they wanted a periscope lens at the last minute and just tucked it in the corner. Vivo and X and gimbal are synonymous terms now. We've seen the gimbal camera be put in a couple of different places throughout the last few generations, but this time the tech is applied to the 2x telephoto sensor. That kind of makes sense because it's at farther focal lengths that steady hands can only do so much to keep things smooth. It also kind of makes sense because, in all honesty, our more conventional optical image stabilization systems and smartphones can do more than enough for like the main sensor, and then software stabilization is usually enough for ultra-wide lenses. Anyway, the sensors we're working with here are an exclusive Samsung sensor in the 50 megapixel main, a 48 megapixel ultra-wide, the 12 megapixel shooter in that gimbal supported 2x telephoto, and then that periscope in the corner is an 8 megapixel shooter that triggers at the 5x level in the camera app. Here's an example of how much this camera is trying to do. Even though every lens has on some level stabilization, you can still add layers on top of it. The main and the 2x benefit from good OIS and even better gimbal stabilization respectively, but then there's this software-based stabilization on top of it, and you can further smooth things out. The thing is, it's actually just using the main sensor, so it's actually not using the gimbal. It's a little bit weird how Vivo decided to put some features in certain places than others, but still, you get very good stabilized footage. I was just trying out some of the stabilization modes, and you can see the difference in these clips that obviously when you have it turned off, and I was using the typical smartphone camera grip with my index finger and my pinky holding the phone up just in one hand. Yeah, you obviously have a lot of shakes. And then you turn on the standard stabilization, which basically is using all of the hardware that is built into the sensors, and you can use that across the different lenses. It is available in more than just one sensor, but this is just at 1x. After that, Ultra, locking it at 1x, adding in some of that electronic stabilization on top, but also bringing it down to 1080p resolution at 60 frames per second in the case of this video. Finally, turning on what was really interesting to me, the horizontal line stabilization. Clearly the sensor that is using that is able to just lock its perspective the entire time, even if you move the phone like crazy. And by that, I mean doing stuff like this. Like, I'm sorry if this is disorienting, but even if you're moving the camera in these crazy ways, it's going to keep that horizontal line steady so that you have your horizon always in the right place. No matter what you do here, it's trying to keep the horizon. And as you can see in this clip, I'm actually rotating it like 360 degrees, but since that lens, for whatever reason, has like the ability to stabilize it perfectly, or maybe the software is keeping the horizon line regardless, well, that's the effect that you get even if you put the phone literally upside down. Now, on the topic of the gimbal telephoto, I have to give it some props real quick. Yes, a gimbal at farther focal lengths makes sense, like I mentioned. It's further practical because 2 times here is basically 50 millimeters, a focal length that is usually useful for multiple scenarios. Now see, main sensors on a lot of smartphones tend to be pretty wide, but we use them the most because they have the most or the highest powered sensors. That is also the case with the X80 Pro, but by putting in a gimbal on the 2 times telephoto, they're trying to give it a bit more practicality as well. That's because when taking photos, going 2 times and thus about 50 millimeters, it provides shots with a little bit more background compression, making for more focused composition and more effective portraiture. And what is one of the main situations where you want to put your best foot forward? Well, that's in portrait mode. And in portrait mode, you can actually use that 2 times telephoto with the gimbal stabilizing everything once you hit that 2 times button while in that mode. Unfortunately, the gimbal system is not one that you'll really be able to take advantage of when shooting video. In my testing, which includes putting a finger over each lens to see which one is actually being used in various modes, it seems that when it comes to video, it is relying on the main sensor the most. Kind of makes sense in a way, and also, like I said before, on a smartphone, OIS on smartphones tends to be pretty dang good already. You don't necessarily need the gimbal robotic-like movement in your smartphone videos, but still, it would be nice to still have the option to use the 2 times for like 4K video recording or for just general video recording as well. Vivo have seemed to program these cameras so that even if you hit 2 times in the photo mode, but for whatever reason it's not able to use the gimbal enhanced lens, it just uses the main sensor and crops in. That's less than ideal, but nonetheless a nuance that is in this camera system. Okay, I'm just jumping in here real quick. Obviously I'm editing the video right now, and while I was editing the video I got a little bit curious because you know that I always shoot at 4K resolution with all of these phones. The fact that I'm not able to on the front facing camera here was already a little bit of a bummer, but that got me thinking, what if you can use the gimbal on the rear cameras at 1080p resolution though? There's that clip where I am at 4K resolution, I put my finger over all of the different lenses, and sure enough, every time I do 1 times, 2 times beyond that, it's always cropping into the main sensor. That's a little bit of trickery that I've been starting to see in some of these Chinese flagship phones. That is a bit of a bummer, but then I moved over to 1080p resolution and I did the same test. Sure enough, at 2x, it did finally move over to the gimbal stabilized sensor. All right, here I am at 1x for a classic reveal shot. There you go. The main sensor is still doing a really good job, and with that low aperture, it was able to go from the foreground to the background very smoothly, easy on the eyes. OIS on smartphones, already pretty good. Now we have the gimbal going. Again, going from foreground to background, but it stayed on the background because the minimum focusing distance is pretty far for the 2 times. But look how stable this footage is because the gimbal is actually finally being used. But again, this is only at 1080p. So you can use the gimbal in video, but it's got to be at 1080p. There's just all this trickery that keeps going on with these phones. I get that the hardware is crazy and Vivo wants to put so much stuff into these phones as much as possible so that they can actually like achieve so many different things, but it just makes these phones so complicated. And I'm trying to do a camera test here, it just kind of makes me pull my hair out. I mean, look at my hair. So far, much like with last year's phone, enjoyment and usefulness with the Vivo X80 Pro boils down to some fundamental benefits. Stabilization and smooth movement do elevate the video recording even if it's not actually being done by the gimbal most of the time. And like I said before, having the gimbal on the 2 times telephoto just means that that focal length and portraits as a result can get a little bit more stabilized, and thus you can make sure you get the right and crisp shot. As far as pictures are concerned, for the most part I felt pretty fine, but you can see this Zeiss logo here on the back, and it's all over the camera interface. I have to make a confession though, I'm not too sure just how much it's actually helping or enhancing my photo taking experience. Aside from various portrait effects, there is one button that's always at the top that says Zeiss, and it's apparently natural color tuned by Zeiss. For the most part, it's just subtle. If you want to go in on, let's say, different saturation levels, even go black and white, you can always just swipe left and right in the camera interface. Speaking of those Zeiss portrait effects, in general they are pleasing to the eye, and as you go to the different Zeiss portrait effects, the bokeh is supposed to change, but I actually haven't really seen it do it a whole lot. Portrait cutouts haven't really given me any problems so far, so ultimately portrait mode in general is fine. And again, even though the gimbal is in the 2x telephoto lens here, the main sensor is still the highest powered one. It will give you the most quality, the most detail, and it will probably be the one that you still use the most. But at the very least, you have a little bit more of a reason to zoom in just a little bit, even if it's just for portraits. So clearly there's so much to consider and so much to talk about when you have the Vivo X80 Pro. Even in the camera app, you can see here there are many more modes and features that I didn't even really get into here because, well, the video would get too long, but also they're not really things that I would typically use on the daily. A common but honestly significant bummer at this point is that the slow motion mode here, even at 120 frames per second, is still always at 1080p resolution. I think our camera hardware is powerful enough to give that 4K 120, and it's something that I try to use as often as I can when it's available, but it's not here. Anyway, all of that said, there's so much to talk about in this phone, but that was a look at what I shot with the Vivo X80 Pro while in Boracay, and a little bit after. I want to know what you all think about the footage and the photos that I have here, and if you'd be down for a gimbal-supported camera system like this, let me know in the comments. For more on the Vivo X80 Pro, make sure you subscribe to my channel, sound off by hitting the like button and by getting into the comments. But from all of that, I'm going to go ahead and call it on this one. Thank you so much for watching. Please take care of yourselves and each other, and enjoy your tea, everybody.